Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm just going to get right into it. The question of validating the path. When you consider the reasoning I have just outlined, you might think it all sounds fairly rational and seems to make good enough sense. But what evidence do we have to show that these arguments are valid and that their logic is meaningful? Is there a proof that we can observe or experience? On this question, I would like to refer to an explanation that I found personally helpful, which is taught in the Sakya teachings, in the Lamdari tradition of Path and Fruitin. According to this, there are 4 valid factors of knowledge, namely valid scripture, valid treatises or commentaries, valid teacher, and valid experience. In terms of their origin, of course, the valid scriptures were taught first, and the valid commentaries were elaborated on them later. Then, on the strength of their study, valid teachers emerged who became masters of those commentaries. This led to their having valid experiences. However, from the point of view of the development of one's own personal conviction, it is suggested that this order is reversed. In other words, one must first begin with some kind of personal experience. If we take the case of reflecting upon the 4 seals, or the empty nature of phenomena, or the benefits of altruism, unless we have some taste or personal experience of the theme, that is, unless we have a glimpse of its truth, it is less likely that we will be inspired deeply enough to persist in our practice. Of course, there are many different levels and degrees of spiritual experience. There are profound levels of realization, which I for one may not have, but there is also a beginning level, which we all have. In my own case, whenever I contemplate on the virtues of compassion and altruism, I feel deeply moved. But how can we know that such experiences are valid? One way is to look at the effects they have upon us. When we reflect on certain spiritual qualities and cultivate them, and when we begin to feel deeply inspired, this creates a sense of inner strength. This experience makes us more courageous, more expansive, and less prone to worry or insecurity. All these are indications of the validity of our experience. So, as I mentioned before, reflecting on certain spiritual qualities often moves me deeply, and this profound inspiration then increases my admiration of the masters who personify these values. Contemplating in this way, I begin to recognize that perhaps there is some truth in the biographies of the great masters and in their accounts of profound spiritual realization. No doubt we have to accept that anecdotal accounts and biographies are often prone to exaggeration, especially in the case of over-enthusiastic presentations of Guru's qualities by his own discipline. However, we cannot dismiss an entire category of literature on the grounds that it is untrustworthy. This cannot be the case. There must be some accounts of masters that relate to genuine experiences. Indeed, this is not the only instance of exaggeration. In the Buddhist literature, when I read a very sophisticated commentary written by a great scholar on a short text written by one of his masters, the commentary is sometimes so detailed and comprehensive that I began to wonder whether the author of the original short text really had all these points in mind. So when you can relate to the experiences narrated in the biographies of the masters from the vantage point of our own personal experience, you begin to develop deep admiration for the valid masters. From valid experience, then you proceed to valid master, and once you respect the valid masters, you then develop conviction in the treatises they have written, which in turn helps you to develop a deep conviction in the basic source of the teachings. namely the Buddhist scriptures, I personally find this way of approaching the teachings very helpful. You start from your personal experience, which constitutes the cornerstone of your spiritual practice. For a Buddhist practitioner, especially for a Mahayana practitioner, it is vital to have deep admiration for the Buddha. And that admiration must be grounded in a profound understanding of the essence of his teachings, the Dharma. The understanding of Dharma should itself be based on the understanding of selflessness or emptiness that I mentioned earlier. To perceive the Buddha merely as a historical person who was a great teacher, with admirable and extraordinary qualities and immense compassion, is not the perspective of a serious practitioner. A Buddhist appreciation of the Buddha should be grounded in knowledge of his central and most profound teaching, which is emptiness. Such a person should realize that Buddhahood, or complete enlightenment, is the embodiment of the four kayas, or four Buddha bodies. This principle should itself be understood in relation to another fundamental point, which is that, at the deepest level, mind and body are non-dual. Therefore, the fully enlightenment state should be understood as the total non-duality of wisdom and compassion. To sum up the discussion so far, the four seals or axioms of the Buddhist teaching tell us that the suffering that none of us wish to experience comes about as a result of affective thoughts and emotions, which in turn have their roots in false views. The four main false views are holding things to be permanent, believing impermanent things will bring happiness, holding things to be desirable, and believing that things enjoy independent existence. These views can all be eliminated, and this is done by developing insight into the true nature of reality. As you cultivate this insight and enhance it, false views are gradually eradicated along with their derivative thoughts and emotions. This process requires discipline. It is through such a process that transformation takes place. In terms of the actual method of bringing about a transformation of heart and mind, the Buddhist tradition explains that there are two main dimensions in the path, which are known as the method aspect and the wisdom aspect. One can say the method aspect, which includes the various skillful means employed on the path, is a preparatory phase. It enabled the practitioner subsequently to apply the wisdom or insight that eliminates negative afflictions directly. Question. In a busy city lifestyle, it's sometimes tempting to remove oneself to go and meditate somewhere peaceful and leave the world behind. When you say it is more important to stay with one's normal lifestyle or to give in to the temptation to escape it? Answer. It depends very much on the individual. If the person is a very advanced practitioner who is totally committed to a single-minded life of meditation and retreat, then of course there could be cases where the individual should seek a life of solitude and abandon the world, as it were. That is said to be the highest form of spiritual practice. But this is not appropriate for all practitioners. In fact, practitioners of this caliber are very rare. Generally, for practitioners like ourselves, it is far more important to be an effective member of society, someone who makes a positive social contribution and integrates spiritual practice as much as possible into daily life. One must simply find time in the morning or in the evening to do some contemplative practices, meditation, and so forth. For most of us, that's the best way. Otherwise, what can happen is that people escape from society and spend some time alone and later begin to realize that actually it's a very hard thing to do. Then slowly and quietly and with some embarrassment they try to sneak back into society. Another question in here. What type of meditation would your holiness suggest for beginners? Answer: reflect on importance, and if you have some wider knowledge, then reflect on the nature of suffering. You could also contemplate the nature of cessation. Actually, contemplating on the Four Noble Truths is the foundation of the Buddha Dharma. So begin by reflecting alone these lines rather than visualizing yourself as a deity. Mantras only keep our lips busy. For a beginner, I think there is a certain limitation to mantra practice. A master from Amdo in eastern Tibet once said that when you recite mantras too much while applying your rosary beads, instead of diminishing your negative emotions, it might only serve to diminish your nails. Here's another question. Your Holiness, please speak about prayer from a Buddhist perspective. If there is no deity, to whom or what do you pray? Answer: usually we appeal to higher beings like Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and others who are more powerful than us. That's the Buddhist way. But these higher beings were not higher beings from the outset. Originally, they were like ourselves, and then through the training of their own mind, they eventually became Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This is how we understand it. Question: can we combine the Tibetan repetition of mantras and various visualizations with the practice of Vipassana? Not in the same session, mixing the two, but in different parts of the day? I feel I need two practices. Is this wrong? Can you give us your idea on how to do this? Answer: of course it is perfectly possible to combine two practices, even from the point of view of the Tibetan Buddha path. The core practice is really the contemplations carried out within Vipassana practice. The Vajrayana practice of reciting mantras and doing visualizations are complementary to this. They enhance the actual practice, which is the contemplation. There is a danger that people get the impression that in order to practice Buddhism in the Tibetan way, you need all the ritual aspects of it, such as blowing the long horns or playing the clarinet and cymbals and so on. But this really isn't the essence of the practice. In fact, I used to tell people, including Tibetans, that perhaps one of the greatest exemplary figures in Tibetan history, whose life embodies the true practice of Tibetan Buddhism, was the great meditator Milarepa. Yet if someone had searched his meditation cave, I'm sure they wouldn't have found any longhorns, cymbals, or clarinets. It is said that when the Indian master Atisha came to Tibet in the 11th century, he was met by a large congregation of Tibetan lamas. There was a huge reception, and he saw them approaching from a distance. They were very impressive-looking lamas, on horses that were very ordinary, decorated with all sorts of colorful garments and bells, and the lamas themselves were wearing impressive costumes with colorful hats. Some hats were even shaped like a bird's head. Atisha was so surprised and shocked that he cried, "Ah! The Tibetan ghosts are coming," and hid his face. He didn't want to look. He thought it was a hallucination. The Tibetans got the message, so they descended from their horses, and the horses away, and changed into simple monastic robes. When they then approached the Indian master, he was pleased to meet them. Many Tibetans know this story, and we recount it constantly over and over again. Yet somehow, despite this, we seem to get caught up in colorful rituals, paraphernalia. When I was in Lhasa, of course, I would dress in expensive silk brocades. But I think if we pay too much attention to these things, both the teachings and the rituals themselves become superficial and come to lose their meaning. Since we became refugees, we have had a very good opportunity to change these things. I have stopped wearing all these expensive clothes. The simple monk's robe I wear is very good, easy to wash, and very comfortable. Brocade is very rough on the skin and is not easily washable, and especially in the Indian heat it gets dirty very easily. So circumstances itself has made it impossible to wear such elaborate clothes, and I think that's very fortunate. I am sure that if one were to inspect one of those vests the monks wear in Tibet, one could almost guarantee that the dirt collected on the collar would go back to several generations. I think such things are really foolish. We repeat the Buddha's name, but by carrying out these practices, we neglect the Buddha's instructions, and that is very sad. Whether we follow a religion or not is entirely a matter of an individual's choice. But if we want to follow one, then we should take it seriously and practice it wholeheartedly. That is important. So I feel the time has now come for Buddhists to re-examine some of their traditional habits. The same goes for other religious traditions too. Once you accept a religion, you should be serious and sincere, and put it into practice in your day-to-day life. Then it will be of some value. If religious faith is just a custom, it is not much use. Until next time, thank you for listening.